Hey, what's going on with shipping? Sal Mercogliano here. So, if you are interested in preserving the maritime heritage of the United States, I have a deal for you tonight. We're going to be watching a video put together by the National Maritime Historical Society, of which I am a trustee. But more importantly, you're going to see my good friend Kathy Green, the president of the National Maritime Historical Society, introducing Charles Anderson. He'll be talking about sinking the SS United States, the battle to save the world's fastest ocean liner. For those of you who don't know, the National Maritime Historical Society aims to preserve the maritime heritage of the United States. We're hosting a conference up in Buffalo, New York on September 24th to the 27th, the Maritime Heritage Conference, celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal. But more importantly, we're commemorating the maritime heritage of the United States. Very few organizations are committed to such an endeavor as the National Maritime Historical Society. If you watch today's video, the proceeds from today's video, those commercials you got to pump through, all the money from that is going to the National Maritime Historical Society. And if you contribute to this channel and go over to their site and join and become a member, you are contributing to the maritime heritage of the United States. So enjoy today's video.
Our speaker tonight is Charles Anderson. Now, Charles is a full-time maritime arbitrator. I can't speak tonight. And a consultant and a member of the board of the SS United States Conservancy. From 1988 to 2021, he was senior vice president and the head of the Skuld North America, the subsidiary of a major Norwegian marine insurance association. Previously, he was a partner in the law firm of Holland and Knight, where he practiced in all areas of maritime law. He is a graduate of Columbia University and received his master's degree from Princeton University and a law degree from Columbia Law School, where he later taught admiralty and maritime law. While on active duty with the U.S. Navy, he served on destroyers and in naval intelligence and retired with the rank of commander. He's a longtime friend of the National Maritime Historical Society. And of course, he has some keen interest in this story because of personal ties of his own. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Charles. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to try to share my screen. I hope I can do this.
Fantastic.
Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. I'm delighted actually to be here tonight to talk about the world's fastest ocean liner and America's flagship, the SS United States. Many of you may have been following what I think was astonishing social media coverage of the ship when she was towed from Philadelphia to Mobile, Alabama, where she's going to be, or she is currently being prepared for reefing off of Destin, Florida. The ship was towed much closer to shore than I expected, so that it enabled literally thousands of people to, watch her while she was being towed. And the outpouring of emotion I found was absolutely incredible, particularly because most people probably never had any real association with the ship. My own connection with it, let me just quickly mention, my father was the ship's captain and Commodore of U.S. Lines from 52 to 1964. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Unless you belong to a certain generation or you're a fan of historic ocean liners, and many of you here tonight may be, sometimes the presentations I give are to people who are really total strangers to maritime history, but that's not the case here. But I thought I would start at least with a little bit of background on the ship's early history, construction, and service life, and then follow up with a description of the very long battle to save the ship, first from scrapping and then to restore her to seagoing service, and later to convert her into a hotel, convention center, and museum, and ultimately now the world's largest artificial reef. So if we start from the very beginning, the saga of the SS United States is inextricably linked to the man who designed her, William Francis Gibbs. In the early 50s, Gibbs was probably the most accomplished naval architect in the US, but he had no formal training in naval architecture. As a boy, he was captivated by the big ocean liners of his day. And as an undergraduate at Harvard, he spent most of his time redesigning British battleships in his dormitory room. He was also very upset that for over 100 years, no US flag passenger liner had been able to capture the coveted blue ribbon from the German and British competitors. He never graduated from Harvard, but at his father's insistence, he actually managed to attend Columbia Law School. And for 2 miserable years, he practiced real estate law in Philadelphia. But in 1915, he and his brothers concocted a scheme to build two super-fast 1,000-foot transatlantic liners to embark passengers in Montauk, Long Island, using the Long Island Railroad as an express service. And this, according to their scheme, would have reduced the transatlantic travel time by almost a day. And they were able to sell the scheme to none other than J.P. Morgan, who controlled the International Mercantile Marine Company, which later became U.S. Lines. Unfortunately, World War II intervened, and they weren't able to realize their goal. But they did go into business for themselves, and they formed what later became Gibbs and Cox, again, probably the most famous naval architecture firm in the U.S. Instead of the 1,000-foot fast liners, they were actually given the task of converting a ex-German liner called the Vaterland. At the time, this was the world's largest ship, and it was seized at the beginning of World War I and used as a troop ship called the Leviathan. With the idea that it would enter commercial service as a U.S. flag transatlantic liner. And although he wanted her not only to be the biggest, but also the fastest liner, the Leviathan was never able to capture the blue ribbon from the Cunard liner Mauretania on an actual ocean crossing. So the next milestone was the contract for the construction of the SS America, which was launched in 1939. That's pictured on the right here. And the America, unfortunately, was caught up in World War II. So her initial career was mainly as a troop ship carrying troops to various theaters of war. She was renamed the West Point. Then she came back to service after the war and had a very successful career as essentially a smaller version of the SS United States sister ship, as it were. And just as a footnote, she actually managed to outlast her glamorous younger sister by a quarter of a century. She went through many different owners, and she eventually grounded off the Canary Islands in 1994. And portions of that hull, unfortunately, I think you could be able to see if you're ever in that part of the world, because there's still some of it is still afloat. Then during the war, Gibbs and Cox focused on designing ships for the U.S. Navy, and they reportedly designed almost 3/4 of all the Navy ships during the war and almost 2/3 of all U.S. cargo ships. The construction of the United States actually was in large part influenced by Navy design rules. She had 2 engine rooms, just like the World War II carriers. She had 4-compartment flooding, meaning that you could flood 4 compartments and the ship would still maintain her intact stability, and a lot of emergency backup systems for use as a troop ship in time of war. And these so-called defense features added considerably to the cost of construction, but they were also essential to obtain federal support for the project in the form of construction and differential operating subsidiaries. So after much haggling, the U.S. Lines Board of Directors agreed to contribute about 28 million to the total construction cost of 78 million. That would amount to probably over 800 million today, and the balance was paid by the U.S. government. The government was never really terribly satisfied with this arrangement, and the Controller General at that time actually tried to renegotiate the contract, but the Defense Department was insistent on building a very fast transport that could carry 14,000 troops to any theater of war without refueling. And public support for the liner in the early 50s was absolutely overwhelming. One of the reasons the Navy was particularly interested, and I think there was a question about this, during the war, the Queen Mary was used to transport troops to various theaters, and at the end of the war, she had transported, I think, in excess of 800,000 troops and traveled 600,000 miles. And the U.S. really had no liner that could accomplish the same thing. So the Navy was very intent on having a transport that could match that and probably exceed it. And Gibbs seized on all of this. He was, I think, probably less known for his skills as a naval architect, although those were quite formidable, but rather his ability to bring together all of these different elements that were necessary to build the United States, which included technical, financial, political, and also the media. So the keel laying began February 8th, 1950. A lot's been written about the ship's design features, so I'm only going to summarize the most significant ones. The first, of course, was the United States' incredible speed. During her sea trials off the Virginia Capes in early June 1952, a speed of nearly 40 knots at full power. The formula for that success, although Gibbs was very secretive about it, but it really shouldn't come as a surprise because it was really the use of very high-speed steam turbine engines, which generated a shaft horsepower of 240,000, combined with a very light displacement because of her aluminum superstructure. You'll note here the ship's propellers. She had two four-bladed outboard and two five-bladed inboard propellers constructed of bronze. They were designed by Elaine Kaplan, who was one of the several women whom Gibbs employed on his design team. And you wouldn't notice from the power plant on the right, but nearly all the controls, and by the way, I just visited the ship 2 weeks ago in Mobile, and I was able to go down to the engine room. And it was quite incredible because the ship is full of levers, valves, pressure gauges, pipes. Unlike modern vessels, there was no digital equipment, no automation. So all of this had to be operated by human beings by hand. And I think it's fair to say that the ship probably represented the very pinnacle of mechanical engineering. There's never going to be another ship like that. And quite a testimony to I think, some 100 engineers who were responsible for the propulsion system. The other obsession that Gibbs had was with fire safety. He was horrified when the new and luxurious American passenger liner, the Morro Castle, burned off of the coast of New Jersey in 1934 with the loss of many lives, and then followed by the burning of the French liner Normandy in 1942. He was convinced that existing rules for fire safety were inadequate, and so he strictly banned the use of any wood whatsoever on the SS United States, except with the legendary exception, I should say, of the butcher's block in the galley and the Steinway piano in the first class ballroom. But the downside of that obsession was that the ship was full of asbestos throughout, which would later become a major problem. Also, the aluminum lifeboats and the deck chairs and fireproof furniture sort of contributed towards the impression that the interior of the ship was somewhat sterile. And that was fostered by the Cunard Line's rather malicious description of the United States as the world's most beautiful troop ship. But this impression, I think, rapidly subsided when most passengers were really captivated by the ship's stylish and ultra-modern look, and not to mention the sensation of incredible speed She was really, truly the seagoing Concorde of her day. But what made her particularly unique, I think, was simply patriotism. The ship was built as a testimony to American optimism, ambition, power, and technical prowess. And she was built entirely with American labor, believe it or not. And every US state contributed materials to her construction. Just a few other innovative features. Probably most important was the large use of aluminum in the construction and the use of air conditioning throughout, which was a big help when the ship turned to cruising in the Caribbean in her later life. She was also the first largest ocean liner ever to be built entirely in dry dock. And this was largely because of Gibbs' third obsession, which was secrecy. He jealously guarded all aspects of the ship's design and construction, and particularly the underwater hull construction and her propellers, and of course, the engine rooms. So the dry dock was partially flooded during the christening ceremony, which took place on June 23rd, 1951. And as you can see, all of these underwater configurations were nearly completely hidden from public view. She was winched out of the dock rather than rolled out on railings. And then during her sea trials off the Virginia Cape, as I mentioned before, she achieved a speed, it said, in excess of 40 knots under full power. And even going astern, she was able to achieve a speed of 20 knots, which was what the Titanic maximum speed was going ahead. So, a total, a triumph in terms of engineering over previous vessels. So the long-awaited maiden voyage commenced on July 3rd, 1952. In those days, there were no security restrictions on the number of visitors who could go on board. So some 8,000 people boarded the ship to see off about 1,600 passengers, and another 5,000 lined up along 12th Avenue to watch her sail. At 12:36 p.m., the United States passed Ambrose Light. Now, normally Ambrose is the finishing post for this North Atlantic racetrack, which the great British and German liners used when they were traveling westbound. But for the first time in history, it was now the starting point for the eastbound voyage. And 3 days, 10 hours, and 40 minutes later, after leaving Ambrose, the United States passed Bishop Rock, the easternmost end of the racetrack, breaking the record of the Queen Mary by an astonishing 10 hours. And on the eastbound crossing, she achieved an average speed of 35.59 knots and secured the blue ribbon, which she still actually holds. And on the return westbound passage, the ship set another record, completing the maiden voyage at an average speed of 35 knots. So the ship received an ecstatic welcome in New York. There were helicopters, fireboats, ferries, small pleasure craft joining the waterborne parade. Commodore Harry Manning, who was the skipper at the time, and the chief engineer, William Kaiser, were given a ticker tape parade down Broadway. And there was actually a bronze plaque on the sidewalk which commemorates the event. And it's not far from another one celebrating the Apollo moon landing, just to give you an idea of the significance of that achievement. And after the maiden voyage, the ship settled into regular liner service between Le Havre, France, Southampton, England, and Bremerhaven, Germany. I particularly love this picture of the ship docking in Bremerhaven. To me, it has a sort of dreamlike quality. And the Germans were fantastic fans of the ship, I think, because it was the first major passenger liner to call in Germany after the war. And it sort of represented Germany's re-entrance into the world community. But the ship has always had a very enthusiastic following, from the Germans. And I should probably mention here, you probably know this, but in 1952, and the basically the entire 50s, the jetliner hadn't really fully captured the scene, and the ocean liner was literally the only way to cross. So the passenger lists of all of these great liners were literally a who's who of all the notable politicians, presidents, business leaders, movie stars, and artists. And among the United States passengers, I have to mention this because to me, it's so significant, were Bob Hope, Princess Grace of Monaco, Salvatore Dali, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, Marlon Brando, Duke Ellington, Walt Disney, Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Presidents Harry and Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, and future presidents John Kennedy and Bill Clinton, who was en route to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. So literally, you can name almost anybody in the 50s and early 60s who was anybody, and they probably crossed on the United States or one of the other large liners. The masters of the ship, the captains, were all graduates of the Maritime College, and they all had what I think could fairly be said would be impeccable navigational credentials, but they had very different personalities. The first master, Harry Manning, who was in command during the record-breaking Maiden voyage, was perhaps the most colorful of these. He was said to be an excellent boxer, pianist, tango dancer, student of Shakespeare. He actually volunteered as a navigator for Amelia Earhart's 1937 attempt to circumnavigate the globe by air. Fortunately for him, when they landed in Hawaii, because of a mechanical problem, he claimed to have been recalled to duty by U.S. lines and thus avoided the fate of his replacement when the plane vanished over the Pacific. And while master of the U.S. Lines passenger liner Washington, just before the U.S. entered World War II, he successfully defied a German U-boat commander who threatened to sink the ship, and was also involved in a very heroic rescue at sea of the crew of an Italian liner, for which he was given another ticker tape parade down Broadway. This was before the second one. Unfortunately, he was also a very outspoken critic of maritime unions, and he refused to become a member of the Masters, Mates, and Pilots Union. It was also said that he didn't get along with Mr. Gibbs, which was sort of like not getting along with God. And the U.S. Lines president, General John Franklin, it said they would have preferred breaking the ship in gradually before going for the record on the first attempt. I'm not sure I really buy that, but it seems that the die was cast against Captain Manning on the second voyage because the United States swept past the Queen Elizabeth without slowing or saluting. Manning denied that they were racing. He just said, "We weren't racing, we just raced past her." But for whatever reason, he chose early retirement, and he was replaced as permanent master by my father in early 1953. Now, my dad was fortunate enough to serve as master until 1964 during the so-called glory years of the ship, when the United States operated pretty much continuously at full capacity. Also, he very diplomatically altered course to avoid overtaking the Queen Mary and Elizabeth whenever they met at sea. I was extremely lucky to have been one of the passengers, but my experience was a little bit different. U.S. Lines had a policy that family members of officers could not travel on the ship when they were on duty, but I was allowed to make a number of voyages when the ship went for her annual dry docking in Newport News as the only passenger. That was quite an experience being the sole passenger on the bridge. When she, went down the Hudson River at night and watching the city lights as she moved towards the sea was an incredible experience. The only transatlantic voyage I made was in 1969 in June, just before her retirement. But I remember that the ship looked as immaculate as if she had just come from the builder's yard. It was incredible that everything seemed to be almost brand new on the ship. The ship's last master was Leroy Alexanderson, who would unfortunately serve only 5 years before the ship retired. In November of 1969, she was supposed to embark on a world cruise and then was abruptly retired from service. The paintbrushes were said to be left in their cans and the uniforms left hanging in their in their closets in the expectation that the layup would only be temporary. But alas, it turned out to be a permanent withdrawal from service. My excuse me, my father and William Francis actually were pretty staunch friends, and every day the United States was at sea, it's said that Gibbs would call him or the relief master and the chief engineer to check on her performance. And on her arrival in New York, he would get in his long gray limousine and be driven from his apartment on the east side down to the Narrows to watch her come in. And then he'd rush to Pier 86 on West 46th Street to watch her berth. He was the first person up the gangway and went immediately to my father's quarters to discuss the details of the voyage. He's pictured here in my dad's stateroom. You'll note the Cocker Spaniel lying at his feet. His name is Chotapeg, which is Hindustani for small drink. And I think it's fair to say he was probably the most famous sea dog of the 20th century. He sailed with my father during World War II when my dad was captain of a troop ship called the John Ericsson, ferrying soldiers to Australia and North Africa. He later was on the America. He logged over 2 million miles at sea. When he died at the age of 14 and a half, he was buried at sea with full honors, and his obituary was written up in the New York Times. Just a couple of stories, because I can't resist talking about Chotapeg. When I was a small boy visiting my dad on the ship, I noticed there were these little small square cutaways with hinges at the bottom of all the doors in the officers' quarters. In fact, they were throughout the ship. And I thought, this is really, really cool. Chotapeg can come and go into the cabins anytime he pleases. Only later did I learn, to my great disappointment, that the cutaways were to allow fire hoses to pass into the staterooms without opening the doors. So it's part of William Francis Gibbs' obsession with fire prevention. The other story I found kind of amusing was one told to me by the executive officer, Captain Alexanderson. Chotapeg rarely went ashore and really had the run of the ship, but the passengers' dogs had to be kept in the ship's kennel. So once on a westbound voyage, the chief purser called my father to tell him that a very important ambassador was coming up to see him about keeping his dog in his stateroom. And my father told the executive officer to quickly hide Chotapeg in his cabin. When the ambassador arrived, he insisted that his dog was very clean and well behaved, but my father explained that it was just company policy that all dogs had to be kept in the kennel. Of course, just then, a steward opened the door to the executive officer's cabin, and in ran Chotapeg. But without missing a beat, my father calmly said, "Oh, that policy doesn't apply to him. He's a crew member." Some other maritime stories. An inducement to many passengers was the possibility of meeting VIPs, traveling on the ship. And as I mentioned, there were a great deal of them. But by far, the most important was the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII of England before his abdication, and his wife, the Duchess, the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. Neither one of them was very shy about manipulating their social clout to their advantage. And after the war, they were regular passengers on the Queens, the Mary and Elizabeth. But this became increasingly annoying to Cunard's booking department because they insisted on the minimum fare, even though they occupied one of the most priciest suites. They would typically embark with over 40 pieces of Louis Vuitton luggage, yapping pug dogs and two servants who also got first-class accommodations at the minimum rate. So the dissatisfaction with the couple that Cunard experienced wasn't lost on U.S. lines. They realized that having the royal couple on board that would likely generate more revenue for the company, and that is exactly what happened. The sales spiked in all three classes when it was advertised that the Duke and Duchess were on board. Of course, the chance to actually meet them was virtually non-existent because they usually dined either in their suite or in the ultra-exclusive special dining room on the promenade deck. But merely sailing on a ship with them imparted a sort of one-upmanship to many of the passengers when they talked to their neighbors and relatives at home. And here the Duke and Duchess are pictured having cocktails in the Navajo bar. I'd be curious if anyone here knows the identity of the lady who's sitting to the right of the Duke. If you do, I'd like to hear your thoughts. And I'll just close this portion of the presentation with a picture of William Francis Gibbs, as I mentioned, watching the ship coming into New York Harbor from the Narrows, something he did almost every time the ship came into New York. Beginning in the 1960s, the ship was beset by frequent labor disputes that ultimately would lead to her layup. And one of those disputes, probably one of the most serious, came in February of 1957. My father was forced to dock the ship without a docking pilot or tugs, a feat that he had to perform twice before his career ended, the last time in a driving snowstorm. In this particular case, the New York Post ran a headline the following day, which read, "Look, Ma, no tugs." After the layup, well, I should say the circumstances of the withdrawal, as I mentioned before, were not only the rise in jet travel, fuel costs, but again, labor disputes. I think those were probably the major reason for the layup because they resulted in many cancellations of transatlantic trips and cruises, and that ultimately caused a decline in the passenger rolls. But after the layup, because the ship was a Navy reserve ship, the United States was hermetically sealed at her berth in Newport News to preserve her interiors and her machinery in case the ship was needed for deployment. And she remained in a state of suspended animation until 1978, when the U.S. Maritime Administration decided to list the ship for sale. And then she passed to a series of different owners. Each one had grandiose plans to return her to service. The first one was a gentleman named Richard Hadley, a Seattle real estate developer, who planned to convert the ship to a seagoing timeshare condominium. His financing unfortunately collapsed, and he was forced to auction off virtually all of the ship's interior fittings. And I mean everything from tablecloths and dishware to bridge equipment. Everything that was movable was basically taken off the ship. The ship was about to be arrested by U.S. Marshals and then was purchased by a gentleman named Fred Meyer, who bought the ship in 1992. He was going to try to make it into a running mate for the Queen Elizabeth II. And he arranged for the ship to be towed to Turkey and the Ukraine to remove the asbestos and other hazardous material, and then towed back to Philadelphia, where she has remained since, well, until the beginning of this year. And then there was another real estate developer, Edward Cantor, who bought the ship, again with the hope of returning her to seagoing service. The ship, unfortunately, was put up for sale again in 2002. And then Norwegian Cruise Lines appeared on the scene, purchased the ship in 2003, and announced plans to restore her as part of its American flagged service to Hawaii. It was a Jones Act vessel, so she could do this under US law. But the global economic crisis intervened, and the ship was again listed for sale in 2009. At this point, I'd just like to show a couple of snapshots showing the before and after condition of the ship. When you see the photos of her present condition on the bow, this is how she came back, basically, from Turkey and the Ukraine, and she's remained essentially in that condition for the past 30 years. Here's the bridge. You see everything basically has been taken out. First class ballroom. Promenade deck, and they're in the process now of removing all of the windows on the promenade deck to prepare her for the reefing. First class observation lounge. Some of these murals, for example, the Currents, the mural, are now on display in the Smithsonian Museum. And of course, the iconic funnels. And tragically, those funnels will have to be removed before the sinking because Uh, the ship will be in shallow water, and it would be a hazard to navigation to leave the funnels in place because they are enormous. They're about 50 feet high, and the ship has to be in relatively shallow water to accommodate recreational divers, so they have to come off. Hopefully, they can be used for a future museum at some point. In any case, Norwegian Cruise Line's efforts to sell the ship were unsuccessful, and so the ship was again threatened with scrapping. In July of 2010, we received a grant from a philanthropist in Philadelphia, probably well known to most of you, Jerry Lindfest. And this enabled the Conservancy to purchase the ship and maintain her for 20 months. And it was significantly the first time in history that a group who was concerned primarily with the ship's historical significance and preservation actually had ownership. Just a bit about the Conservancy. It was formed in 2009. In 2012, it launched a Save Our Ship campaign and actually secured the ship's listing in the National Register of Historic Places and the passage of something called the SS United States Preservation Act. Unfortunately, these were only interim measures. They did not provide permanent relief for the ship. So the Conservancy continued to face challenges in paying for the cost of maintenance and dockage. The last hope of sending the Big U to sea came in February of 2016, when Crystal Cruises announced a plan to renovate the ship as a state-of-the-art cruise ship. They carried out extensive feasibility studies at a cost of over $1 million, but unfortunately concluded that the hull, although it was structurally sound, the technical and commercial challenges to return the ship to sea service were simply insurmountable, and so they abandoned their plan. The challenges of restoring the ship to seagoing service, as you can imagine, are indeed enormous because in addition to the technical difficulties, which would include the installation of modern diesel-electric propulsion plant to replace the steam plant, modification to the hull and interior spaces to meet modern standards, but to satisfy the demands of modern cruise ship passengers, which means having balconies, atriums, water slides, go-kart rings, multiple restaurants, would simply make the conversion far too expensive and far more than the cost of actually constructing a completely new vessel. So again, the Conservancy's efforts had to be refocused on making the United States a sustainable waterfront attraction, providing jobs and public amenities while still educating and inspiring future generations. Now, the Conservancy's vision was remarkably shared by a company called RXR Realty, which is a major New York City real estate developer. And in December 2018, the Conservancy announced an agreement with RXR to explore options for redeveloping the ship. And this culminated in 2020 in plans to actually repurpose the ship as a permanently moored 600,000 square foot hospitality and cultural space. And in 2023, RXR and its partner, MCR Hotels, you might recognize them. They're the managers of the landmark TWA Hotel at JFK Airport, released detailed plans for the ship's redevelopment as a 1,000-room luxury hotel, restaurant, museum, event venue, and public park near the Javits Convention Center. So these are images of the reimagined United States, showing it alongside the pier on Manhattan's west side as part of the Hudson River Park. The top of one funnel would have been removed to act as a skylight, illuminating the hotel and the interior spaces. They were going to use cantilevered cabanas in place of the lifeboats as hotel rooms. Swimming pool between the funnels, and a very large interior-exterior ballroom on the stern. Pier 76 was the optimal site for the vessel because of its proximity to the Javits Center. The project would have entailed the reconstruction of crumbling adjacent piers, creation of new public green space, would have led to the creation of 5,700 other jobs, and revived economic activity on the far west side. RXR and MCR completed comprehensive engineering assessments and feasibility studies, as well as financial analyses. to demonstrate the project's economic viability. The team actually included Gibbs and Cox, the original design firm. I was recently actually on the High Line at this very site, and imagine what it would have been like had the United States been there. And I can assure you, it would have been quite incredible and a wonderful addition to Lower Manhattan. Unfortunately, at the same time, the Conservancy faced another challenge. In 2021, the Philadelphia pier operator, Penn Warehousing, decided that the rent should be doubled and terminated its contract with the Conservancy for the dockage. The Conservancy objected to the increase, and the dispute ultimately resulted in litigation and trial. In June 2024, Judge Anita Brody of the Federal District Court in Philadelphia dismissed the rent claim, but she ordered the ship to be moved within 90 days, which raised concerns that the ship simply couldn't be relocated within such a tight deadline. And compounding these difficulties was the announcement by RXR that it was abandoning the redevelopment plans because it was unable to obtain necessary approvals from New York State and city governments. Sadly, I think the lack of the city and state representatives' vision really amounted to what Walter Cronkite, who was an honorary member of the Conservancy Board, called a crime against history. But there it is. So the desperate search began. And you can see here all of the various ports where we were looking for alternative pier space, but none met the three requirements of accessibility, suitability, and availability. So the final chapter occurred last October when Okaloosa County, Florida, purchased the ship from the Conservancy with the intention of sinking her for use as the world's largest artificial reef off the coast of Destin, Fort Walton Beach. It's estimated the project will take about 18 months at a cost of $10 million, but the county has earmarked $1 million of that to establish a land-based museum for the ship. The land-based museum will consist, hopefully, of recreations of the ship's onboard spaces, her radar mast, one of the iconic features, and either one or two funnels, as well as a very large collection of artwork, furniture, and archival documentation of the ship's design and construction history. I've shown here a picture of the USS Oriskany, a large aircraft carrier, which was also used as an artificial reef back in 2006 by a neighboring county. Apparently very successful and will result in a huge amount of revenue for the county. So they're very enthusiastic about this project. I'll close now with a couple of scenes of the ship being towed from Philadelphia down the Delaware River to Mobile, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. You can see her here passing under the Walt Whitman Bridge. Clearance was very, very tight, only about 8 feet, but she made it. And there were thousands of spectators who lined the Delaware River to watch her leave her berth. And more gathered on the shores of the Atlantic over the next week. You can see some of these pictures here, very dramatic because it appears as if the ship were actually underway due to the length of the tow line. And again, the outpouring of emotion on the social media was just incredible. This one I like particularly. When the ship reached Florida off the shore of Pompano Beach, the captain of the Royal Caribbean cruise ship, Utopia of the Seas, one of the largest cruise ships in the world, actually diverted course to approach the ship and told his passengers about the ship's history, sounded 3 whistles to honor the SS United States as she passed. It's a great picture because it shows you the difference between modern cruise liners and the classic ocean liners. Don't ask me to go into that because I'm obviously very prejudiced, but it's an incredible photograph just showing this contrast. So again, mentioning the museum, we're hoping that it will come to pass and it will honor America's flagship and inspire future generations. We are committed to preserving that legacy, which hopefully will continue in the future. But wait, we're not over yet. Something called the New York Coalition to Save the SS United States was formed a few months ago. And it's launched believe it or not, a last-minute campaign to prevent the reefing and return the ship to New York as a tourist attraction, cultural facility, and/or industrial residential complex. She would be put in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn in the Gowanus terminal. You can see her pictured here with the red dots. They have sent an open letter to President Trump requesting an executive order for the US government to take ownership. And they filed suit in the Northern District of Florida and Pensacola, essentially for injunctive relief to prevent the ship from being further dismantled. Believe it or not, the county's motion to dismiss was denied by the court recently in April. So there is still some degree of hope. I think they've refiled a motion, but the battle is not quite over yet. So stay tuned. I'll stop here. If any of you have a favorite beverage with you tonight, I'd like to close by repeating William Francis Gibbs' famous toast: "Here's to the big ship, and everything you've ever wished for doubled." So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. What a fascinating retelling of that story. And I just this last iteration of of what's happening is just phenomenal. And thank you to you and the Conservancy and everybody who has kept this going. Um, if people would like to submit some questions, we'll take a few. We have a little bit of time here. Please use the chat function, and I can relay those questions or comments forward. Actually, here's an interesting piece that Peter McCracken dug up. Again, our maritime researcher extraordinaire from the New York Times Memorial of Chotepeg from 10 July 1957. Quote, "One fact they did recall was that one day during World War II, aboard the troop ship John Erickson, Chotepeg had been instrumental in introducing the Commodore to Mary Beard, a member of the Women's Army Corps. Miss Beard subsequently became Mrs. Anderson, a clear indication of Chotepeg's importance to you, I suppose."
I'm not sure how he did that, but yeah, I'll accept that story as true.
It was in the New York Times, the paper of record. Fantastic. Let's see. We have some folks expressing so who are in support of okay, sorry. Different topic, different topic. Is this presentation available to share? We have recorded it this evening and it will be up on our site. So yes, once we have that up in the next day or two, you'll be able to share that. Any other questions here? Hearing none. Hearing none.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And
pleasure.
thank you everyone who came tonight and listened. And thank you for supporting NMHS. And we look forward to seeing you at our next seminar presentation and at our events in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you.